Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I'm reading from a New York Times book review
Yes.
of Amity Shlaes' latest offering, Great Society, A New History. And so she looks at all the Great Society welfare state programs of the Johnson era forward. The reviewer, Benjamin Applebaum, concludes his review of Amity's book saying, half a century later, after the Great Society, in the midst of a revival of interest and ideas like Daniel Patrick Moynihan's basic income proposal, readers may find themselves wondering whether the nation's problem is really too much government or perhaps not enough. It's funny, this book review suggests that Amity's arguments are, sort of prosaic in some respects, and yet isn't this reviewer's argument, well, his insinuation, the most prosaic thing of all? What is the lament of the government commissars when a government program fails, an agency fails? What is the constant lament? You can set your watch by it. The only problem, not big enough. I mean, we are the epicenter of that. You know what the problem with this anti-poverty program is? This rent-seeking gambit is?
It's not big enough.
Not big enough. It's always, if it was just a little bit bigger, then it would all be synchronized and work just as envisioned in our utopian white papers. Thank you, Elizabeth Warren. For more on this, let her respond to this book review in part and lay out the arguments that she makes in her latest book, Great Society, New History. We're pleased to be joined by Amity Shlaes, who chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, the winner of the Hayek Prize, named after my dog, and again, best-selling author. Her previous book, which was great. If you haven't read it, go back and read this, The Forgotten Man: A New History of the Great Depression. Amity, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Amity, are you there?
Do we have Amity?
Hello, Amity.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Hello.
there we go. Were you?
I'm sorry.
That's
sorry,
all right.
guys.
That's all right.
Yes. Good morning. I'm glad to be there.
Good morning. So what of this question, rhetorical though it is, by the New York Times book reviewer of your book, that the nation's problems half a century after the Great Society, too much government or not enough?
Well, the evidence from the 1960s suggests that there's too much government because the 60s were an enormous expansion of government, including, by the way, in Chicago. Chicago's in the book. And the results sought by the dreamers were not realized. It was very sad. So that's the answer. You were very polite. That review, I believe, calls my book deeply flawed. So I thought it was kind of you, Dan and Amy, not to mention that. But the point being, this is a very contentious subject, especially now, and it's especially controversial to argue for restraining government.
And you mentioned in your book, or you said a mention about Chicago being mentioned in your book. What references did you make?
Oh, there's a lot of Chicago. I grew up on the South Side, and I was raised to believe in Hyde Park that Mayor Daley was, mainly corrupt. And Richard J. Daley comes off more sympathetically on the record than I ever would have imagined. And what's kind of hilarious are his power struggles with Washington. Mayor Daley supported Democrats, and Mayor Daley believed he got big Democratic presidents elected, famously or infamously with John Kennedy, and then, of course, also with Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So he heard they were doing some stuff about poverty, and he sent all his ideas about poverty, his plans for his administration, to Washington in a big box and said, I need money for these plans, please provide it. And instead, the Johnson administration came up with its own poverty offices and went by him and worked with gangs, particularly the Blackstone Rangers, in ways Mayor Daley viewed probably accurately as counterproductive. And he got furious at Washington, and it's very interesting to watch the back and forth. This was also replicated in other cities. That is, the Great Society administration of Lyndon Johnson did not work with cities. It worked around them and often undermined them.
The review in the New York Times of your book, the reviewer also criticizes it in this way. While the book is well written, the evidence you use to prove up your thesis is selective. You you skip over Medicare and Medicaid in terms of the war on poverty programs and focus in on lesser initiatives like public housing projects. And the author suggests, of course, you're skipping over Medicare and Medicaid because they're very popular and they've worked so well.
Now, that's interesting. I'll just take the other programs first. The goal of the Great Society was to cure poverty. They used the verb to cure. They didn't say make poverty feel better. They didn't say provide a palliative. The Great Society did not cure poverty. Indeed, poverty reduction slowed down after a time. Then we're looking into the 70s, now in the 80s. Medicare and Medicaid are outside the scope of the book, the effects of Medicare and Medicaid, because the book ends in 1971. The real damage of Medicare and Medicaid, as much as we love them, and we often do, is that they enslave our children to higher taxes than we ever will have paid in our lifetime because of the obligations they've generated and will generate. So I like to be able to go to the doctor and get a fixed price, but I do want my grandchild to be able to start a business, and that is the trade-off. Medicare especially, the funds running out well before Social Security. So that's a long-term effect. That was a little stretchy of Benjamin to blame me for something that's absolutely outside the book, but you could argue Medicare and Medicaid are just as bad as welfare in terms of their effect on the United States long term.
Well, and this is an important point because both parties have essentially taken a hands-off approach to all the welfare state entitlements, and Medicare is at the top of the list because it's hard to argue an abstraction, but it's also hard to defend the fact that most Medicare recipients, or the median Medicare recipient, will get $3 in health care services for every dollar they paid into the system. So it's a bit of a reverse Robin Hood, as you mentioned, on future generations, and that's not something that should be applauded, much like Social Security, going back to the New Deal, isn't something that should be applauded when you can get a much better market rate of return. It'd be difficult to get a worse market rate of return than the 1% that people get back from their Social Security contributions. So, these government gambits, people get used to the entitlement, but if you look at the underlying math, it's a lot less attractive.
Oh, yes, and, from time to time, even politicians from Illinois, I'm thinking here of Dan Rostenkowski,
sure,
have worked on health care to try and get it more affordable and been just shouted out of the room and the project because of complaints. I'm recalling, right, Illinois?
Yeah, being chased at chased from a gas station by seniors. I remember, yeah.
For calling for, I think, catastrophic coverage, but the listeners will know better. Dan was right to try to curtail the growth and costs of Medicare, so that's interesting. So that's where we are. What's interesting to me is also, and to you, I know, the folly wasn't always so evident to the people at the time. Lyndon Johnson, out of the goodness of his heart, wanted to give old people health care. At that time, Lyndon Johnson expected to live fewer than 10 years after he left office. He expected to die in his 60s. He did. So did a lot of other people. They never expected the life expectancy that we have currently. So that's part of the story. You make a promise. It sounds reasonable by your arithmetic, your best effort, best intentions in the world, but you cause an effect you never could have dreamed of. That's throughout the Great Society. That's why it's worth studying.
And the chapter that you do devote to public housing projects, of course, we know now those human warehouses were devastating, particularly to minority families who lived at Cabrini Green and the Robert Taylor homes and the other public housing projects around the country. That was a terrible public policy that now has metastasized in real time to quote-unquote affordable housing that's pushed by the left, which is exacerbating the divide in cities that have most aggressively pursued quote-unquote affordable housing projects, like in Los Angeles.
Yes, architecture is part of this, and I'll be even more divisive when I say architecture is part of this. Modern architecture, particularly the style brutalism, which is popular. Think of the HUD building in Washington or Pruitt-Igoe and international style, roughly, alienates people. and then being stacked like hamsters on top of each other alienates them, particularly when welfare policy kicks out the dad, which is what was the policy for so many years. So we created terrible institutions that hurt the Black community again, displaced them once more by moving them into these houses, hurt everyone who lived in them. That was interesting too, to watch that. What concerns me is just as socialism is becoming popular again, so is modern brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture is beautiful. I'm talking about big concrete slabs that kind of scare you and look magnificent, like fortresses. It's kind of intellectually interesting. Some people like the grandeur of it, but people become very sad when they live in big concrete slabs. There's no way around it. People like doors and having a geranium and little steps up to their house. And so along with the new craze for socialism comes a new craze for alienating architecture.
I, on the other hand, live a Spartan existence.
So you like that
just
idea.
me and my dog. No geraniums.
Oh, by the way, his dog's name is Hayek.
Yes.
So by winning the Hayek
great.
Prize, you get to keep Hayek for a week.
Yeah, that's part
Congratulations.
of your. That's part of your
We'll
prize
bring a bag
package.
of dog food for you.
Can I say who Hayek was? He was a great free market
Yes.
economist, vaguely at the University of Chicago, loved by some economists there, such as Frank Knight, not loved by some others. And he wrote a book called Road to Serfdom about how incremental changes and expansions in government, the kind Dan and Amy were talking about before in my books about, it seem safe because they're small and incremental, but add up and take us on a road to economic serfdom.
Yes, and the fatal conceit of the central planners is also relevant to this discussion, and particularly Chicago and Illinois. I want to ask you about something that Peggy Noonan wrote, though, because I think she's sort of right neighborhood, wrong address. She's talking about the Democratic primary field, and that they're flailing. They don't see they're flailing. They lurch too far left too quickly. She writes that if there's a grinding war and an economic downturn, people will want change, and the out party has a good shot. If the economic downturn is severe, they'll consider deep structural change, even radical change such as socialism. It isn't true that America will never go socialist. Maybe it will, but not under current conditions, full employment and rising wages. I want to believe that she's right, but I see us having very good economic conditions at present, and yet socialism, as you were just mentioning, being au courant among at least half the electorate.
Yes, and I'm thinking back to whatever I said or you said in 2008, but I do think we trashed ourselves in 2008. The administration trashed ourselves by rescuing big banks in a kind of socialist way, by the way. Oh, this bank needs some help. Oh, we got to work this out. Oh, we don't want to help who? Lehman, because we don't like Lehman, but we like Goldman because some of us, and it was very pick and choosy, very, very random, hard on investors, and the message came loud and clear. We rescue during downturns. So how can you not provide families with some kind of break in a recession if you're providing Goldman Sachs with one? There are a couple of people in Chicago who have been saying that loudly, and I'm glad for it because you don't hear it too often in New York, which is the center, the financial capital. I think we hurt the argument for free markets with government behavior in 2008, auto industries after that. Actually, bailouts don't work for anyone. It's another way of putting it, as we say, picking losers, helping. When a company is weak, if you help it, you make the employees there feel better for a short time, but you don't help the economy generally.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. She is Amity Shlaes, chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, winner of the Hayek Prize, best-selling author of The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, and her new book, Great Society, A New History. Amity, thanks for joining us, and best of luck with the book.
Well, honored to be on. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Balance of nature. Changing the world, one life at a time.
I love the products. I haven't had a cold since I've started. My grandkids get sick all the time, and I don't catch what they have. I'm going to be 68 tomorrow, and I'm in great shape, and I'm very grateful. I know the balance of nature, the simplicity of it and the purity of it has just been a tremendous